Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos, and I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. Right-wing terrorism and violence has a long history in America. Founded in 1865, the Ku Klux Klan became a vehicle for Southern resistance during Reconstruction, using widespread acts of terrorism and intimidation to promote white supremacy. At its peak in the 1920s, Klan membership exceeded 4 million people nationwide. After the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, a resurgent Klan escalated a campaign of terrorism and violence against Blacks, civil rights activists, Jews, and others that included bombings of Black schools and churches. Between 1956 and 1963, an estimated 130 bombings were carried out in the South alone. A 2020 Center for Strategic and International Studies report showed that right-wing terrorism accounted for 73% of deadly terrorist attacks in the United States. Radical Islamic extremists were responsible for 27%. Furthermore, the Department of Homeland Security conclusively stated that white supremacists were the country's top domestic terrorism threat, and in 2021, the FBI elevated the threat to the same level as ISIS. The Southern Poverty Law Center has been the leading civil rights advocacy organization in the South since its founding in 1971. Bringing litigation against white supremacy groups, researching and classifying hate groups and extremist organizations, and leading the fight to promote tolerance education programs. In recent years, the internet has become the most important tool for these groups to communicate to a broader audience and recruit new members to help carry out and finance their operations. An unparalleled opportunity to spread their subversive messaging and propaganda, violent plots, and racist conspiracy theories. The center has taken on the challenge. We're thrilled and blessed to have Michael Edison Hayden on the Radical Imagination today. Michael is a senior investigative reporter and spokesperson for the Southern Poverty Law Center, where he's written extensively on internet radicalization and far-right extremism. He wrote the guide on open source intelligence for Columbia University, numerous crime features for Vice, and his work has been featured regularly in the New York Times, Slate, Foreign Policy, ABC News, the Wall Street Journal, Democracy Now!, Al Jazeera America, the Financial Times, the Times of London, and others. He's also a 3-time grantee of the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. So, Michael, thank you so very, very much for being here on the Radical Imagination.
Glad to be here, James.
It really, really is. And I want to start with a little bit about your own education. You studied playwriting at the famous Iowa Writers Workshop. So you wanted to be a playwright, and how did that help with your work you're doing now, and how did that help you with crisis reporting?
Well, I mean, I think how it helped me in the most practical sense is learning how to structure things, because I used to write box dramas and things that you couldn't leave the room, or the essentially you're relegated to one set, and he forces you to be a little economical and move to a point. So that's like maybe the best lesson from it. But I mean, from a purely like psychological perspective, we are dealing with a lot of people who have strange motivations, to me at least, and it helps me to I think to try to peer into the minds of some of the folks that we cover and better understand them to cover them more closely.
Right. Strange motivations, to put it mildly. And listeners, mentioned right before the show, this is an area where a lot of people, including probably most of my audience here, really are fairly clueless as to what is going on. There's so many different groups you're tracking down, trying to keep track of. Help our audience and me understand the major players in this new world of far right nativist extremism. This is not right. Your fathers and grandfathers' typical neo-fascist, neo-Nazi type organizations, or are they?
Well, you know, the number of groups of the Southern Poverty Law Center tracks from year to year, you know, keep going down in recent years, and everybody's like, oh, well, how can that be? Because we palpably sense the degree to which far right extremism is getting worse in the United States. So, like, you know, what explains that? And you know, the reality is that things have become much more diffuse through the internet. People are, if you picture folks going together to meet in some kind of community center or town hall or someplace to discuss something, that is not happening with a lot of the folks who we cover on a regular basis. They are, you know, it's much more like a series of prison cells in which nobody knows what anyone looks like, but they're communicating through the walls. And that's kind of the best way I can describe some of the communication that happens on Telegram between far-right extremists and so forth. At the same time this is happening, we have very high-profile social media influencers who are also far-right extremists, right? So, you know, there's, I think, it's hard sometimes for people who don't pay very close attention to this to understand how somebody who could be a verified person on Twitter could also be a far-right extremist. But we have people who have no discernible credentials, who are promoting this great replacement conspiracy theory, and you know, deliberately doing disinformation in order to you know, or promoting disinformation in the hopes that they're going to get people to align with fascist views or to, in some cases, do violence. So there's this combination of, again, diffuse, disconnected people all over the internet and social media influencers, and that makes the emphasis on groups significantly less.
Diffuse, disconnected people. You're talking about, are you talking about fragile people with fragile mental health realities here?
Yeah.
Or you mentioned again motivations. What do we know about these motivations of these people? Are we still at the beginning stages of trying to understand them? Or are they similar to some of the motivations that we've uncovered, or we did uncover through such social science works as the authoritarian personality? Are we talking about obviously different people, but with similar sorts of mindsets, worldviews? And what is the end that these people are looking for? What do we know that? Is it just creating chaos, disorder? What is the ultimate outcome, if there is such a thing?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many different kinds of personalities that
Right.
we're talking about here, so it makes it really difficult to
Yeah,
say.
let's
Now, we're
break
talking
it.
about,
Yeah.
if you want to talk about the type of people who carry out mass shootings, for example, that's hugely different from the type of people who are influencers, or at least aspire to be influencers. Speaking of the influencers, there are some who are true believers, and there's some who function as just paid political operatives who are in it for money and for power. I'll give you a couple examples of different types of people like that. Right? There is Nick Fuentes, who is a white nationalist who was who was in the VIP. I think he was invited to the VIP section of Trump's speech on January 6th. You know, he talks about, like, we need to bring things back to the Middle Ages, and we need to punish women for speaking up, all the kind of very bizarre things that he says that are not popular. In Fuentes' case, he says his goals, his ambitions are to take the current Republican Party and move it further and further to the right, so that he is at the center of it, essentially, that it just, continue to pull it further and further. And for that reason, he will go out of his way to support figures who may not be perfect in the eyes of white nationalists, maybe like Trump or Blake Masters, but tilt what they extremists call the Overton window. What is possible in our political world, right? There are figures like that. And then you can say that they're
egomaniac in a sense.
Yeah. Motivated, is he motivated to do that because he wants to live in that world? I think a little bit, but I think there's also, by doing so, he's able to cultivate a group of fans who are extremely young white men. Extremely young, meaning some of them probably in high school and some of them are in college. And there are all these rumors that he tried to control certain like lieutenants in his group, their sexual behavior and making judgments about whether they were seeing women or not, things like that. I'm not going to read into it very much, but there's a desire to control others. And in the political sense, there are these very clear lines that he's drawing, this friend-enemy distinction, where he is seeking to be on the other side, on the good side, in his mind, on the friend side, and to punish everybody who's on the other side of that. And it's interesting because he actually has, as you can tell from his name, Nick Fuentes, he actually has some Mexican heritage, I believe, on his father's side. So it's just, you have a white nationalist who, for all intents and purposes, probably not accepted by many neo-Nazis, who is cultivating fans this way. Wow. It's complicated, right? I mean,
how many? Can you give us a rough idea of how many people are actually listening to him and following him? Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean they will act, but
I think I think his streams do in the tens of thousands typically. Really? But there are two different types of fan bases we're talking about, right? So there are social media influencers. Fuentes has now been kicked off of all major platforms. At the time he had 130 something thousand followers on Twitter, and a significant following on YouTube. I think he was suspended from there in 2020. He has a relatively small, passionate group of fans, and that's a sort of a different fan base than someone, other figures that we cover, in the sense that he was able to suggest people attend these Stop the Steal events and hype these Stop the Steal events in the run up to January 6th, and large numbers of people showed up. Really big crowds of young white nationalists showed up in support of Nick Fuentes, and his flag ultimately flew inside the Capitol building that day. So there's a small group of fans, but they're extremely passionate and they're willing to do things for him. That's one example of a type of personality. Then you have a guy like Jack Posobiec, who is a social media influencer who has tried to make it kind of as a journalist and things like that. He's lied. Well, I don't want to say he's lied, but he has promoted himself. Not ostensibly lied. I mean, he promoted himself as a former CBS News employee. He never worked at CBS News. I called them. He promoted himself. In his book, he said that he went to Wharton. I called Wharton. He did a summer program that was like for pay that had no entry, whatever. He's a bit of a grifter and was not very well liked when he was in reserve naval intelligence. This guy. But Posobiec has been what he primarily does is traffic in disinformation, like Pizzagate, for example, was his thing. And he really pushed the Stop the Steal campaign, right? He has 1 million followers on Twitter. He's been accused of using automation or bots or someone has been doing it around him to amplify his posts sometimes. But he undoubtedly has a big fan base on social media. What is he motivated by? I mean, I don't know what his goals are primarily. He seems like a narcissist who's, excited for attention to me. He seems like somebody who really wants to be close to, the inner circle of people like Trump and things like that. You got people motivated in that way. Then you have on the lower end of the scale, since this kind of fascist movement in this country has become so big and broad, for lack of a better word, neo-fascist. You have people on Telegram who get hooked in on this great replacement stuff and this eliminationist rhetoric, and then they go in and they shoot people, like the terror attack in Buffalo, for example. That's a totally different story, and they are absolutely in a fragile mental state, and they're not necessarily driven entirely by narcissism, but they are sociopathic. It's a wide range.
Sounds like so they're not working necessarily in tandem, but sort of parallel. Some are trying to push the Republican Party to take a more hardline authoritarian stand. I mean, also they've. I wanted to get to the issue of the Silicon Valley and Twitter as sort of radicalizing engines for extremists. How does that work? How have they profited from being, in a sense, enablers of this, or how would you describe their role?
Well, you started with one question. I'm just going to quickly say, if you look at these campaigns, for example, like Pizzagate, Stop the Steal, these very big campaigns that have really effectively created disorder and chaos in the country, they function. When I say that, like it's disorder, it feels chaotic and broken up. It functions a lot more like improv than a script, in the sense that you have the dialogue with these social media influencers. They're sending things out there. Pizzagate is a great example of that, where it's just sort of like, okay, we've got this material and these emails, these Clinton campaign emails. What is this pizza thing? It seems to be catching on in this way. Let's push this. It is like, if you think about a movie where there's no script, but there's just scenes and we know it needs to go in a particular direction. That's how many of these things kind of function, where they feed things out there and they kind of take what the people who are receiving them are sending back, and what they like, they amplify further, etc. So that's the way that's just the way I try to describe it. And then your next question was about Twitter and stuff like that. So big tech companies. All right. How about this? We spent a lot of time during January 6th talking about Parler, and during the Tree of Life terror attack. If you remember, when 11 Jewish people were murdered by a heavily radicalized individual who was on Gab, which is a kind of a low end answer to Twitter for white supremacists. When you look at those incidents where everybody all of a sudden will begin to focus on, or 8chan, for example, that was the one that tied to so many mass shooters, posted their texts, their so-called manifestos, for example, Christchurch, on 8chan or InfinityChan. And they, to eventually, where there's a lot of deplatforming happens and these small websites get a lot of negative attention. I personally think that big tech companies must love that, right? Because it pulls the attention away from their role in these very same incidents. Because every one of those people who winds up on one of these sites that get associated with a terror attack or something, or some major violent incident, they all start their journey on the path to do these things on mainstream sites. And Twitter is a perfect example of a website that is, like, since usually traffic's in the top 5 or 6 websites in the world. You could be on the website all the time and not really, now, because of the way they've handled moderation, not really encounter white supremacists as much as you used to, but they're all there. And I sometimes refer to it as blue gab, which is the color of Twitter, Twitter's logo, where it's just basically like these areas that are segregated kind of from responding to people, where people are going through the same radicalization process that they always were, where they're only seeing content that they want to see, and the algorithm is feeding them increasingly radical content because that's what they want to see, and in some cases recommending, because we use sock accounts sometimes and test those out, and we follow one thing, follow another, then Twitter will recommend that you follow like 10 or 15 white supremacists in a row. So it's very easy for people to get pulled further and further from a kind of a hardline Republican point of view to something more radical from there. And then they wind up on, Telegram or one of these things, and they wind up in a violent incident or something like that. And again, those fringe sites take all the blame, but the more highly trafficked website is where it begins.
Interesting. And the more public faces to all of this, where would you put Stephen Miller or Steve Bannon, Fox News, Tucker Carlson, Laura Ingraham? And what are there power brokers behind all of this? Dirty money, the Koch brothers. I mean, no, this is not them. Is that correct?
Well, that's actually, that is really interesting question, because people stop talking about the Koch brothers relative to, figures like Peter Thiel, for example, who is much more explicit about his interest in an anti-democratic United States, in a country that is ruled by a hard right authoritarian regime. He won't say those words explicitly, but the type of candidates that he promotes, Blake Masters, Chris Kobach, who was too extreme for Kansas, his affiliation with figures like Jack Posobiec, who he had in his house during the launch of Kobach's Senate campaign, his affiliation with Ann Coulter, who writes for the white nationalist website VDare. A lot of people don't realize that she does that. Peter Thiel has really become the money guy that everybody points to. But actually, the Koch brothers project over years has really pulled us closer and closer to the moment that we're in right now. And I would recommend reading some of the reporting done by Alex Koch, who is who works for Center of Media and Democracy, I believe it's called. And he's just a great reporter, follow the money reporter, and he's shown that there are these, there's this dark money bundled and then filtered to white supremacist groups like American Renaissance and VDare, which is have nonprofit status. So Koch money, Mercer money, those type of things wind up in the hands of the very people who promote this stuff. And as the Republican Party gets more extreme, as it has been over the last, since Trump's run, really, more and more, it becomes more and more commonplace to find that money falling in the hands of people who promote great replacement stuff.
And
sorry, go ahead.
No. And it's going to cryptocurrencies, right? Almost universally used by the extreme right. What's that about now? Creating an alternative monetary system for.
They lost a lot of money. Recently because the market did not do well. So I think the first most important thing is, like, I actually have some Ethereum. Cryptocurrency is not inherently there's not inherently extremist or anything like that. Most of the people who have it are not seeking to build an authoritarian United States, but it is popular and has been popular among neo-Nazis, white supremacists, for really since Bitcoin was first started being issued, part because you can operate outside of the banking system to some degree. And because of that, because of fears of losing your money in traditional banks, of having, in the middle of a criminal investigation and things like that, more and more extremists gravitate to cryptocurrency for that reason. Also, they're able to run a kind of subterranean business, for lack of a better word. Something like Daily Stormer, which is a neo-Nazi website that was very popular during Trump's run and promoted him very heavily. Less so now, but Daily Stormer, we found first of the month type payments between their tech person and Andrew Anglin, who's the editor, by going through their Bitcoin transactions. So it's been pretty effective for them.
Now, has Trump seen his day with these people, or is he somehow passé? I mean, he's not right wing enough? I mean, are they going to, if he runs again, are they going to, support him, do you think? Or again, is it very nuanced? Some groups are going to be opposed to him and don't like him in some ways. He doesn't go far enough. And how do you think that's going to play out?
Who's going to stop him, on the Republican Party, right? DeSantis.
Right. Nobody is,
allowing
anybody.
This is not really this is not me talking about my research here, but he's going to get up there. If DeSantis tries to run against him, he's going to get there and be like, and call him Little Ron and be like, Little Ron, he tried so hard in Florida, and that's it. And that's it. And then he's Little Ron and Trump's on his way. He's just he's a masterful bully. He's just so good at bullying people and particularly people in his own party. And I think he sees, he sees blood in the water. The second somebody tries to step to him in the Republican Party. So, part of me thinks that unless, if the Republican Party infrastructure starts to get in motion to try to stop Trump, I mean, it's going to be a disaster for them, because he's going to take, he's not going to take that line down. He's going to try to pull his fans with him. As far as the activist types, you're talking about the extreme far right.
Right.
And what they believe. So there are those who believe that they can shift, the Republican Party into a fascist party and so forth. Nick Fuentes, Andrew Anglin of Daily Stormer. And they will continue to support Trump. And I think it's both practical for them in the sense that they have the closest thing they know they're going to get in Trump, in the sense that he's popular. There's also he has a cult of personality, and they think they want to win power, and Trump can help them do that. And then they can continue to move things. And Trump also, I think the fact that Trump is now practically an outlaw status would make him even more appealing, because he's going to behave even more ruthlessly, I think, if somehow he gets into power again. So,
but he would also probably, I'm sorry, but he would also be the one to possibly put these people down, control them in a way if they try to take over too much power. I mean, and the other thing I want to get in there is, what do progressives do? How do we respond? How do we, should we be as concerned about this this phenomenon that you're describing here? I think, of course, we should, but how do we counteract it? Through, movements like the Poor People's Campaign, the fusion politics, electorally. What is the Biden administration doing about any of this? Because again, a lot of these groups seem to also not want to be regulated by anything except themselves. So, what should our role be here? People of goodwill, which hopefully still make up most of the country and most of the world, although we have to begin to question it.
There's a lot of talk after January 6th in particular, of putting new domestic terror statutes on the books and all these other things. I mean, we don't need that. That is the first thing, because these are the very things that will be exploited, against, against good people. And we also, we don't want, to like create some kind of, campaign of law and order terror in this country. We want to be fixing things. And I don't really have a clear answer for you other than at the community level, which is not a political response. People need to be calling this stuff out and taking it extremely seriously, and understand that there is a really dangerous ultranationalist movement in the United States, unlike anything we have really seen before. Even if we've been through the Klan and all these different other things. Yeah. This is something a little different because, they are putting in motion plans to kind of, unloosen, our democracy, and they're willing to. Look at Charlottesville, where people were willing to put their lives on the line and our lives on the line to defend these Confederate monuments that were slowly starting to go away. Never mind the one monument, but that's really what it's about, right? Is the upholding the Confederacy and keep it going. On January 6th, another lost cause, at least in our world. Trump got beaten soundly, despite the Electoral College, which really favors the far right. People were, again, willing to put their lives on the line, their futures on the line, and put our lives and futures on the line for this lost cause. And they're going to do it again. So, and it's going to, it's, in my opinion, it's going to be worse the next time. It's like, these each one of those Charlottesville J6 events inspires the next one. The fact that if you can get large groups, they don't have to agree on everything, but if you get large groups of extremists together, they are willing to do extreme things. And that's why we need to keep calling it out and acknowledging it's real, and not minimizing it. I think there are too many people on the left who for too long said, like, it's the Democratic Party is the problem, and this and that, which is, the Democratic Party certainly has its problems, which are substantial and are contributing heavily to their failures are contributing heavily to the radicalization of these very people. So it's important to point that stuff out too. But there
is no alternative, in a sense. There is no alternative.
Right.
As Cornel West would put it, is milquetoast a response of the Democratic Party that we get? There is no real alternative. There's no third party that's going to take all this on, and this is the best we have, best we can work with.
At the moment. Well, I want to make sure I'm making very clear. I don't want to discourage people from voicing these very real criticisms. The point is, you have to also understand that this threat is real, and it's an existential threat to your children, and to everybody's children, and it's really scary, particularly the kind of coming together of climate change and these disasters, and this ultranationalist movement at the same time. We, as a world, need to be able to be working together. The opposite of Steve Bannon's vision of the world, where all these ultranationalist politicians are building walls and separating each other. We need to work together because there's going to be limited space. There's nothing you can do, essentially. Climate change is going to render parts of the world unlivable, and we have to work together to save the world, essentially. And I think, it's a twofold thing of building a better, for lack of a better word, progressive movement, to build a more effective one. At the same time, forcefully rejecting this and not being afraid to speak up about it is critical. The last thing I would say also is, again, we need to put people in power who are going to address the concerns of everyday people. You see for example, inflation and how bad it is right now. it is a real concern. And it's a concern for my family, right? We have to make budgetary, decisions all the time, and inflation's making it much worse. And it's like, you got to make life livable for people, to have a chance to beat this stuff back, these anti-immigrant rhetoric and these other extraordinarily bigoted policies. They're only effective when people feel totally cynical about the efforts to improve their own lives, and they feel that they're only about keeping people in power and so forth. So it's really tricky. It's a big endeavor. The only thing I can do is continue to provide people information about this stuff and to urge people to take it seriously.
Absolutely, which is absolutely crucial. I want to also just touch a little bit about themes of death and nihilism and of gore that are also part of some of the far right groups. How would you typify that? Are these people going to be in any way satisfied by what you've just said here in terms of getting inflation down and creating a more just society and so on, that they feel more part of? Are we talking about some people here that are really on the edge of I don't know exactly what to call it?
Well, all right. Well, you brought up something that's kind of interesting. I don't know if this exactly answer your question, but we've seen the Buffalo shooters, Discord logs, things like that, just seeds of animal torture and other kind of really horrific stuff that was in there. And it's like, yeah, I mean, that guy is not likely, if you improve his quality of life, he's not necessarily the easiest person to he's not going to suddenly say, oh, yes, I don't want to go murder people. But the type of personality we're talking about here, who in a fragile mental state, who's being fed a steady diet of memes glorifying violence, that person that we are describing here, they are now, not always, but sometimes, taking that kind of extreme antisocial, hateful stuff and tying it to their desires to kill. If you recall, in the Obama years, we had a whole bunch of weird mass shooting incidents that we've had so many in this country that it's easy to forget them. But think about James Holmes, the guy who dressed up as the Joker and went to go shoot people in a movie theater on the day that the third Batman film was released. Okay, that's a little weird, and it wasn't a far right extremist terror attack, but I think it's very easy for me to imagine a version of that same thing with James Holmes now is also subjected to much more hateful fascist propaganda. And that's the thing, is some of the shooters that were people who are, there's lots of access to guns, obviously, in this country. And again, they're in a fragile mental state and whatever else. Some of those folks are now latching on because they're the nihilism that you talk about, is embodied in some of these fascist memes. And they are, it's giving them, a sort of raison d'etre. It's giving them, a claim to some sort of political. It's not really political. It's essentially just bullshit, for lack of a better word. Excuse my language. But it's giving them it's giving them something that it implies that there's a higher calling, and they're, and they, feel emboldened to talk about that way after they've done their shootings.
The true believer, right? It goes without saying, from what or it should be without saying, that easy access to guns, and it goes without saying that this is something we need to also get under control. There are going to be people who, for a variety of reasons, are going to have all sorts of distorted views of the world and whatever. But it's the opportunity to act on it violently that we also are not doing very well on, right?
Yeah, I mean, the center doesn't have policies to advocate on the issue of guns. Um,
Why not?
on a personal, well, I mean, I don't have a policy position that we have settled on there, because what we focus on is what we focus on.
Okay.
I would say on a personal level, my views about the issue have gone through a lot of like ups and downs and changes. I mean, because we've been through, Columbine happened. Was it when I was in high school? I guess. Like, I mean, it's a while ago. So, I mean, definitely, I originally went through the like, I grew up in a house with no guns, and it was guns are bad. It was my mentality. Then I began to evolve slightly on the issue, where I just said like, okay, the issue is culture, and we're never going to do anything about guns. And and is it necessarily the problem? And I just went through all these different things, and I think I've settled now at some of this is just basically common sense, which is that if somebody is feeding themselves, if somebody's feeding themselves propaganda suggesting that they kill, and they are in a fragile mental state, and they're like a 19-year-old guy, there's no reason they need a weapon of war, right? Like, it's like, it just, why would they
Sure.
do that, right? So
Sure.
whatever policy can figure that out would be a good one, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I don't think that necessarily encroaches on somebody's ability to protect themselves and their family or whatever with a handgun or whatever, regardless of what your views of. I mean, we're talking about a different thing, where some people, somebody like that, what is the guy in Highland Park? I mean, what did he weigh? Like, it looked like he weighed 80 pounds, this guy. And he can still operate a gun that can fire so many rounds. I mean, it just stands to reason that like there's something's wrong with that guy.
Sure.
Doesn't make sense on just a basic level. But yeah.
How much, just a couple other points here. How much is this, do you think, still about race, gender, perhaps economic deprivation, but specifically tying LGBTQ people baselessly to pedophilia? I mean, what the sort of sexual obsessions that you see among some of the texting and so on. How would you account for that? What is that all about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has, first to do with control, right?
Control.
I mean, and in some of these, it's some we see people trying to control and live completely differently, right? So Nick Fuentes is a perfect example. I don't want to judge his sexuality or anything like that, but then there was a he's among more than one. Alex Jones is another one, for example, hard right, far right influencer who has had, where they've been going through because they're always filming themselves going through their phones, and they found, and you can see where people slow it down, and still there's with pornography involving transgender women. I mean, Fuentes has denied it, claimed it was faked or whatever else. Alex Jones never denied his. I believe the porn star who was in the video with Alex Jones did make a comment and saying, essentially, don't, if you like trans women, don't behave in this manner. But they're living a completely different life than they're advocating, right? And this is true. I mean, like, this is true. All the stories about Hitler, for example, right, or like that.
Yeah.
So some of it has to do with control, and some of it is just speaks to America's long-standing anxieties and sins regarding race and gender. I mean, they're like, we're fighting a war that we've not a war, but like a battle that has been going on for a very long time and is mutating, and it's gonna take something pretty drastic to stop it for good. It's gonna take a real reckoning, and maybe unfortunately it will require that America loses confidence in itself. I mean, I think we have for forever, we've had this kind of burden of being like this the world superpower and all this stuff. We see that this very fight is harming our standard in the world and the way people view us. We may not have a reckoning until we go further along the line, and I hope that's not the case. But it really is increased decline in this country, the rise of authoritarianism.
Yeah, well, I think we are in the midst of that reckoning, as I think you really put it very, very well. My colleague Jim Gilligan and Bandy Lee talk a lot about domination, disrespect, exploitation. This is all part of the necessity to control beyond what I think is really appropriate. And so that's also something that we're grappling with, as you point out, in the society. And perhaps, and we only just have a minute or two to go, but the issue of radical love and overcoming this in some way by a movement, as I said before, poor people's movement, or some of the attempts to bring out the best in us. And I use the term radical love, speaking truth to power, but understanding what's going on with people who have been disenfranchised, who have been exploited. And it's a tough lesson to learn, but we need to do that. I just am curious, last question on this. How would you put Christian right fundamentalists in all of this, or fundamentalism generally in this schema? And do you see any threat, legitimate threat on the left, the authoritarian left?
So, the short of it is some of the figures we mentioned, Fuentes, Jack Posobiec, right? Those are two of the people I mentioned on the show, have really started to use this kind of Christian nationalist rhetoric, right? Because it's a little bit safer to use than explicitly white nationalist rhetoric, but it kind of functions as a stand-in for some of these folks, in the sense that, like, you could say, well, you don't. I'm sorry. So we allow religious freedom and protection for Jewish people and Muslim. What about Christians, right? Which is true. My own family came from Egypt, and they were a Christian, and we know about Christians being persecuted in Egypt. We don't want that, right? Like, religious persecution, bad. This is not a complicated idea, but it is increasingly be used as a stand-in for that. And then there are the true believers, and then there are some people who, for example, have pro-life views, and they just believe that a fetus is a baby, and right, there are all these different levels of it, right? And I would say that that what you're really talking about here are people who may not really give a damn about Christ, but are willing to use that to tap into that Christian part of the country, and also to provide safety for themselves in articulating, something that is essentially just a fascist talking point. Do I see any threat from the authoritarian left? I mean, I think, well, first of all, the whole Antifa thing has been used as essentially a grand disinformation campaign to try to create an equivalent.
Absolutely.
Right. So if there is a threat, I do think that the left needs to find a way to speak to working people that isn't so focused around language and things like that. This is not me saying that, that's another boogeyman, is like woke culture, right, where it's like overstated and things like that. But I am disconcerted by the number of people of color who who are finding this MAGA movement, or putting their trust in that even in the face of explicit racism sometimes. And it's like, well, what are they seeing in it? I think that like finding, being able to speak in a common sense way, that just to understand that social change can only happen when you are not isolating people.
Absolutely.
Is critical.
And we could go on. We have to do this again. You've been so enlightening. 2 seconds. What does that poster stand for in the back? Underworld.
That's right. Like that's like a 1996. It's like a progressive electronic. Well, not progressive politically, but like an electronic album by a British group from 1996. It's
okay. I'll have to look
it's like it's very it's an album that I remember fondly from my high school years.
Okay, well, I will check it out. Thank you. You've been terrific, so enlightening. We're over time. Thank you again. I hope to do this again with you at some point soon. Take care. Right. We'll be in touch.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. And thank you so very, very much for watching us here on The Radical Imagination. We'll see you again next week. This is Jim Vrettos for The Radical Imagination.